Hi everyone, welcome to the February 9th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona. My usual co-host Craig Milkowski, he is not available this week. Craig's also not going to be around for the Pacecast next week, but I'm expecting to have Craig back for next week's forecast ahead of that February 17th weekend. Though I'm happy to have a guest on the podcast this week to help me handicap some weekend racing. That is Michael Domabyl, who's been on the podcast before. Michael's an In the Money media contributor. He is an avid stable duel player. We don't think we've talked about that too much, but I know people talk about Mike's stable duel prowess and hushed tones, and happy to have you back on to handicap a little Tampa this weekend.
Yeah, thanks, David. I haven't covered Tampa with you on the podcast before, but these big days in the spring as they lead up to their biggest card and the Tampa Bay Derby card are always fun. So should be a good sequence. I'll try to do my best Craig Milkowski impression. I'm a TimeformUS user, so maybe that'll help in that regard, but I don't think I can fully replace him.
Now, I know we usually talk about Keeneland when I have you on. I know you're somebody who during the summer is very focused on Colonial Downs. During the wintertime, I know some players like to lay low or just play on the weekends. How does your winter handicapping look typically?
I mean, it slows down a little bit, but I'm such a big fan of the game. Like my Twitter bio, I think you were quoting for some of the other things I'm known for. It says horse racing fanalist, and I think that's kind of how I characterize myself. I'm a fan first. I love watching all the pageantry leading up to the big race days, and so in order to really stay tuned in, you gotta be plugged in year round.
No, I totally feel the same way. And as far as this card goes, we'll be handicapping Tampa Bay Downs on Saturday. Their big race there this weekend is, of course, the Grade 3 Sam F. Davis. It is one of their Derby preps leading into their primary Derby prep, the Tampa Bay Derby next month in March. And the Sam F. Davis, it's really the centerpiece of the Pick 5 sequence that we'll be discussing. Drew a 12-horse field. It probably is the most interesting race to handicap in the sequence. Not that the other races are easy, but it feels like there is the most to sink your teeth into in the Tampa Bay, in the Sam F. Davis, at least from a handicapping standpoint. And at least for me, I found myself trying to build some other pittance around it in the sequence. This Pick 5 sequence, it does feature a couple of other stakes races. Begins with the Minaret and the Pelican, both of those 6 furlong events on the dirt for the older females and males. In the middle of the sequence, right in the middle, is a maiden special weight event on the turf where there is plenty of lightly raced runners, some first-time starters. That makes this a difficult Pick 5 sequence to put together, just given the nature of that race. And then it closes things out with another wide-open affair that's an allowance race on the turf that closes things out. So, Michael, it's not necessarily my preferred kind of Pick 5 sequence, just given the presence of that maiden special weight and some heavy favorites in a few of the stakes early on that I guess we'll discuss right off the bat. But horses that I'm not necessarily way against or way in favor of. So I found myself pushing myself into some directions where I wanted to take an opinion that maybe I wasn't exactly just falling into naturally. But those sequence, if you can find value in some legs, it does incentivize it to build out those opinions in the surrounding legs.
Yeah, I think I felt the same way. I think I developed a couple opinions, one in the stakes race and then one in the turf race prior that I'll feel like will help either make or break my wager for the Pick 5. And then it's just a matter of surviving and advancing in the other legs where I don't have a strong opinion, trying to focus in on the most likely winners that are also not super negative value, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's the way I look at it too. Well, let's get right into the handicapping. Race 7 is what kicks off the Pick 5 sequence. It is the Minaret Stakes, 6 furlongs for the fillies and mares. And I think this race is going to feature one of those clearly defined favorites on the card, and the number 2, Chi-Town Lady. This is a horse that we've seen pretty infrequently over the past year or so. She, of course, was the winner of the Test Stakes, that being her only Grade 1 victory all the way back in the middle of 2022. That was a big upset at the time as she was able to beat Monterey, who was sort of on a downward slide at that point in her 3-year-old season, and I think went to the sidelines after that. Since then, Chi-Town Lady, she's only run 3 times. There have been layoffs surrounding each and every one of those starts. None of them have been victories, although one was the Breeders' Cup. I guess we can forgive her for that. But as far as her 2023 starts go, they're both third place finishes. She was finishing well at the end of each of them. I think you could make some excuses around the pace, especially last time when she really had no chance to close in a race where they crawled up front. But what are we supposed to make of her now coming back off yet another layoff? I know Wesley Ward can do well in these situations, but this feels like a horse that is going to take a lot of money in this sequence. And it's the first one you really do have to develop an opinion about going forward.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the race begins and ends with Chi-Town Lady. I think one thing that is beneficial about that turf race being, with the turf race littered with firsters being third race in the sequence, is that this race is actually first in the sequence, which I think it's going to be interesting to see the tote for clues on Chi-Town Lady. I think if she's chilly on the board, then that's going to be an indication of how she might run. So I'm actually I've come around to the opinion that this is an okay race to start off the sequence, just so that we can check the tote for clues on how she's getting bet. Personally, I've never been her biggest fan, and so I don't really want to default to her in this spot, especially because if she does get bet, then she's going to really get bet, probably down off the 5-2 morning line. And it's just interesting to me that Wesley Ward brings her back here. I have a trivia question for you, David. I'm sure you have the answer because your attention to detail is unparalleled. But how many horses has Wesley Ward started on the dirt in the last 5 years? Do you know?
That I can't say I've looked that up recently. I do not know the answer to that, but I'm sure you do.
It is 0, and he's only started 5 horses on the turf, and they all missed the board, and they were all under 5-1. So this is just an interesting move for me to be coming back at Tampa, and so I ended up looking in some other directions. The horse that I kind of reluctantly landed on was the number 3 Unifying. And I think that's just a function of the last race is probably one of the better races that any of these horses come out of in the field. And Mary Quite Contrary and Nostalgic, who didn't really run that day, are both pretty solid horses. And I think the key thing with Unifying here is that she kind of lost position at a key point in the race coming around the turn. And that kind of set her up behind the 8 ball as Mary Quite Contrary took the overland route and polished off that field. So I think the slight cutback to 6 works for Unifying. And now I say I'm going with a horse. I was against Chi-Town Lady for Ward not having much success at Tampa, and Riley Mott has never started a horse at Tampa. So I kind of talking out of both sides of my mouth there. But I do think that the logical alternative to Chi-Town Lady for me was the number 3 Unifying. I don't know if you had any different opinion.
No, I mean, I think your point is you would expect a trainer like Wesley Ward to have started a horse at Tampa because that's sort of Wesley Ward's reputation. He's got horses running almost everywhere. I mean, it seems like any track you go to, he's got some $5,000 claimer even that he'll be running, especially through the Mid-Atlantic and South. So, I mean, we'll see what we get from Chi-Town Lady coming back off this layoff. I remember when I was making the line for her when she ran at Belmont back in June of last year, I wasn't sure what to do with her because she felt like the kind of horse that could take a lot of money, the kind of horse that could be dead on the board. She ended up taking money and not really running that day, though. Like I said, I think the pace is working against her in that spot as it was sort of dominated towards the front end. I'm not going to be surprised when Chi-Town Lady through the rest of 2024 turns out to be the best horse in this race. I mean, she certainly has the resume to build on some of that form and class that she showed earlier on. My big concern with Chi-Town Lady is the 6 furlong distance because she just is a horse that has done her better running over the past couple of seasons, going 6.5, but primarily 7 furlongs. And maybe it's just a function of where she showed up because she hasn't run that often. And she just happens to have run the best in the 7 furlong races. But given the fact that as she's gotten older, she's a horse that just lost all of her early speed. She drops way out early and has to make this big late run. And we'll just see if that works in this race. There is some speed signed on. How much the pace is going to be contested towards the front end, it's a little difficult to read because a lot of these speed horses that are in the race do have that versatility where they can also sit and stalk. So it's going to be interesting to see which rider really gets aggressive in here and tries to take advantage of the situation. But coming from way off the pace at Tampa, it's not something I love. And Chi-Town Lady, it just feels like that's the way she's going to run. I have no argument with the horse that you brought up, that you like, Unifying. I mean, to me, she makes a lot of sense in here. She your comments about her last trip, I completely agree with. It just seemed like she was in a good spot and just got shuffled back very slightly coming to the top of the stretch. And, normally I'd like to see a horse like that finish a little better than she did. But when you consider it was her first start off the layoff going a mile, I think you can forgive it. And going back to last year, I mean, she was running some nice races when they sprinted her. Her speed figures were improving through the middle of her 3-year-old season. Now she's a 4-year-old, so it's pretty easy to project some further routine improvement. I mean, I go all the way back 3 back, and that victory over Alva Star looks pretty good in retrospect. So she makes a lot of sense. The other horse that I was looking at as my primary use in this race would be the number 4, Lady Rattler. And she is a horse that is a little inconsistent. She's kind of up and down. They tried different surfaces and distances with her. I'm not going to hold the Raven Run last time against her because that turned out to be one of the better 3-year-old filly dirt sprints that we had seen run all season in 2023, as Vava and the vastly improved Alva Star by that point of the season just ran away from that field and got a very fast speed figure, and Lady Rattler just couldn't really hang with them. She also may have felt the effects of coming off the best effort of her career when she had won that Dogwood. She's a horse where you kind of have to walk a very fine line when you're riding her because she sort of just naturally wants to be that runoff type like we saw in the Goldfinch at Prairie Meadows back in May. And I thought Jesus Castellon did a great job in the Dogwood, just kind of harnessing her early speed, reining her in, but not letting her get too rank, and then unleashing her when it really mattered in the stretch. It was sort of that covered up trip that usually like to see turf horses get, and it worked for her in that dirt sprint. Coming off the layoff, at least it's 6 furlongs, and I think 6 is probably just a better distance for her than 7, given her natural attributes. And Jose Ortiz is the kind of rider that might fit her pretty well, where he's not going to get overly aggressive and use her too much in the early stages. So she was the other one that I wanted, that I thought looked like she was a good fit for this race, because I don't know how you felt, Michael, but I thought a lot of these other horses that are based in Florida, especially some of the ones coming in from Gulfstream, I'm just not totally convinced about the quality of the competition that they've been facing in Florida for the past year.
Yeah, I wanted to try to make a creative case for one of the longer prices on the morning line. Horses like Flag Woman and Poima and Dreaming of Snow, who had that nice victory in the Suncoast last year over this track, essentially on this day last year at Tampa. But a lot of those races, when I watched them back, they seemed both on paper and visually like pretty slow affairs. I wanted to get your thoughts on the number 1 Dream Concert, though, because she's a pretty short price on the morning line, and I don't know if that's where she'll ultimately go off. I was thinking she would be more in that 5 to 6 to 1 range, and I wanted to like her more than I ended up liking her, just because I love a turn back on the dirt, especially one where they've been proven sprinter to have some prowess in sprinting before. But that in that last race, it was kind of a blanket finish at the end. Which I don't really like to see, kind of indicative of a negative race. But the turnback could really work for this filly. And if you're against Chi-Town Lady and you can't really find a creative long shot, then I feel like she's relatively logical as well.
Yeah, I think if you kind of view her through the lens that she's going to be 6 to 1, it's a little easier to get on board her. And I can see that viewpoint. I mean, I do think if Chi-Town Lady is live, like you were getting at, she's probably going to be more in the 8 to 5 range or lower. And I could see Unifying and even Lady Rattler taking some money in here. So Dream Concert seems probably more like a 4th choice in this race in the wagering, if we're going to order them like that. So, I mean, if she's that kind of price, I'm not going to talk anybody off of her. I wish there was just a little bit more when I look through her past performances, especially when I focus on her sprint races. She's just generally been facing weaker competition, and she showed some promise earlier in her career. And you point out that form with Dreaming of Snow, but I just want to see her take a little bit more of a step forward, and maybe going longer in the last start sort of prevented the natural step forward that we might have seen from her second off a layoff, because she was running pretty well that day and just didn't seem like she got the distance, maybe the last 8th or 16th or so. She was actually a horse that I kind of really liked when she got on the turf last year, and it didn't really work out. I still would like to see her get another chance on the turf going a little longer, because I think the 5.5 was just maybe too sharp for her. But just based on the way she runs in her action, I still think that she's a horse that could do okay on the turf. But this spot, it might fit her okay. We'll see what kind of trip she works out from the inside. I didn't get I couldn't get that excited about her, but if she's the kind of horse that does drift up, maybe even to the 7 to 8 to 1 range, I could understand upgrading her a little bit. And the benefit of this race is you're gonna get to see the tote board before crafting that ticket.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm circling back to your point on Lady Rattler. That's another one that she's another one I would want to use, especially. I mean, if she runs back to her dogwood, that's as good as anything that Chi-Town Lady has run. And I actually think that the pace situation is murky enough where I think her best chance might even be to send. Like that the race at Prairie Meadows, pretty quick pace figures. So this could be a situation where if none of those speed types want the lead and one of them decides to go get it, then that could be a pretty advantageous position.
Yeah, and just before we move on from this race, I guess I should at least mention the 6, Bazinga C, who is first off a trainer switch to Saffie Joseph. Saffie seems to have a lot of success at Tampa. I just couldn't get past the fact that this horse has been in some very live barns in the past. I mean, Tim Kreiser, who wins at almost 30%, and then Brittany Russell, it's a similar situation. So I don't know how much of an upgrade it is going to Saffie Joseph, but I mean, at least it's an angle in a race where I had trouble finding angles on a lot of horses. Maybe she could be a C type for me, but she wasn't one that I could upgrade too much.
Yeah, and my comment on her was I don't know if I'm making too much of this point, especially because she might be a price, but Saffie Joseph's numbers, when you bifurcate them between whether they are running with Lasix off a trainer change or without Lasix off a trainer change, they are significantly worse when the horse that's coming into his barn for the first time has to run without Lasix. Make of that what you will.
That's actually really interesting. I like to look at those stats. I didn't check it out in this race. And most of the horses that we're talking up in this first leg have already proven themselves racing without Lasix. I think that's a conversation we'll get into a little bit more with some horses a little bit later on in the sequence, but definitely something you might want to consider in these stakes where they can't run on it. Let's move on to the 8th race. It is another 6 furlong stakes event. This one for the older males. It is the Pelican Stakes. And we're going to have another clear-cut favorite in here, probably a stronger favorite even than Chi-Town Lady, also going out for the Wesley Ward barn, and that is the number 2, Nakatomi. And I don't know about you, Michael, I had more trouble poking holes in this favorite, and I'll say that as somebody who has never been a big fan of Nakatomi. I know this is a horse that seems to be pretty popular with handicappers and bettors. He's always a shorter price than I think he's supposed to be, and he's just gotten better than I ever really gave him credit for. And his 2023 campaign, looking back at it, he ran well on a number of occasions. I mean, that was certainly true too back in the Phoenix when he chased home Hoist the Gold. That's proven to be a pretty live race in retrospect. And then last time in the Breeders' Cup Sprint, I thought he was kind of ridiculous in that race, and he proved me wrong. He showed tactical speed that he had never displayed before, got a pretty good trip in that race, saving ground, but angled out in the stretch and was actually making a run at gunite at the end for second. That was by far the best effort of Nakatomi's career, and anything close to that performance probably makes him too good for this field. And one more point I'll make about him that just kind of swayed me in his direction is that unlike the first race, the Minaret, there appears to be a ton of pace in this Pelican and need the lead types that are going to have to send, and that would just be perfect for a horse like Nakatomi.
Yeah, that was the last point I was going to make is, man, he's going to get a good setup. I mean, if you look at the number 3, Dr. Oscar, the number 4, Super Ocho, those are absolute speed balls. Those pace figures are off the charts. They have to go. They have one way to go. And then, even throw in from drawn on the rail is the number 1, Hurricane J, who is famously the thorn in the side of Cave Rock, in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile back in 2022. So all 3 of those horses feel like they have to go, and it's going to set it up for someone to come off the pace. And like you, I've never been a huge fan of Nakatomi, but that Breeders' Cup Sprint was quite an interesting trip to watch back. I mean, out of the gate, he was right up there with Speedboat Beach going 6 furlongs in California. So that type of speed, like, it's pretty. I mean, they weren't flying that day, but for him to be up there he was in form that day. And then it was kind of interesting because he kind of looked like he might back up through the turn, but then he kind of, once he got into the stretch, he kept coming. So I know Craig will probably be interested to see to see Nagatomi run, because it'll be more data points for that figure for the Breeders' Cup Sprint, which I know it could have been even higher if the variant wasn't broken out. But he's super logical, and I don't necessarily want to spend too much money against him. But I really think the other horse you have to talk about is Sibelius, because the number 7, because he's in pretty good form as well, and he won this race last year, went over to Dubai, won the Golden Shaheen, and I mean, it didn't really work out after he came back, but he delivered on off the layoff last time in a pretty big way. I mean, it wasn't the most difficult trip, and I think the issue I have with him and why I wouldn't want to put him on top over Nagatomi is just I haven't seen him overcome that much of adversity, at least, especially in his domestic starts. And this seems like a spot where he might have to sit quite a few lengths off the pace and rally in the lane, which is not something I've seen him do super successfully.
Yeah, I'm a little concerned about the trip for Sibelius as well. I guess the one positive thing you can say about Sibelius is at least he is drawn the furthest outside of all of the horses that want to be forward in this race, because Caramel Chip, who's outside him, feels like the one other horse is going to be rallying from the back, maybe from last in this race. And Sibelius can at least probably avoid the kickback, staying outside of those horses. If Junior Alvarado just kind of resigns himself to getting a wide trip in this race, that's probably going to be the best scenario for Sibelius, to just sit outside, no kickback, maybe 2 lengths off the pace, and hope that some of those duelers do come back to him. But I guess the thing you do have to mention with Sibelius is that, like you were saying, he won that Golden Shaheen in Dubai last year. I mean, that's probably the one day he did go overcome adversity. He was really game to win that spot. But the connections have said that they want to defend their title in that race. And I would imagine they're just using this as a stepping stone, a prep race to get back to Dubai. So maybe they're not going to be all out to win this race with him. And they're just looking for a good effort to springboard to the next spot. He obviously did win the Pelican last year before going on to Dubai. But I mean, just look at who was second and third that day. I mean, Dr. Oscar, who's more of a long shot coming back in the race this year. This just feels like a much tougher edition of the Pelican than he was racing in last year. And it even feels like a tougher race than the Mr. Prospector he won last time, even though that was a grade 3 and this is a listed stakes race. Just going through the chart of that Mr. Prospector and who was behind him, it really wasn't that big of a test for Sibelius. He was, bet down to favoritism that day, probably even more of a lukewarm favorite than his form merited. And we'll just see if he's able to overcome that potentially unfavorable pace scenario. But I agree, he's sort of the other class horse in this race that you're inclined to consider. But I think we're leaning in the same direction here, that Nakatomi is just really difficult to build a case against. And again, I don't love taking a horse that has to rally from the back or potentially even from last in a race like this at a short price, because those are typically some of the most unreliable favorites. But he did show that tactical speed last time that we hadn't seen before. I'm certainly hoping that Tyler Gaffalione doesn't try to get involved in the pace like Luis Saez did in the Breeders' Cup Sprint last time. But as you were saying, it wasn't the toughest pace situation we've seen in the Breeders' Cup Sprint. And it just feels like Nakatomi is going to fall into the right trip here. And yeah, you commented on that speed figure for the Breeders' Cup. It was one of those difficult ones to make. Rick and I talked about that quite a bit. And Nakatomi actually was sort of one of the problem horses with giving that race a higher number, because he's been sort of that consistent horse who runs between 95 and 98 buyers, or between 114 and 118 TimeformUS speed figures, and giving him a 125 felt wrong. So we'll see how that figure ultimately comes back. I don't think we've had too many runbacks out of that race yet, aside from Hoist the Gold and maybe one other horse. So we'll see how Nakatomi does here, but it does feel like he is one of the favorites that's difficult to build too strong a case against here. Anybody else you wanted to mention in this race, or should we move on?
Yeah, I would. I mean, the one thing about Nakatomi, I mean, and this is maybe making too much of it, but I mean, it still is interesting to me why he shows up here. Is this kind of the start of a change in how Wesley Ward campaigns some of his horses, starting them a little earlier before Keeneland, and there's not that many places to run, so Tampa is going to be his new spot. I mean, it's not really a strong reason to be super opposed. But if he, for some reason, just doesn't show up, I think the number 8 Caramel Chip is going to get the right trip. And this is all contingent on the fact that, both the number 3 Dr. Oscar and the number 4 Super Ocho stay in the race. If one of them scratches, then the other one becomes pretty dangerous. maybe more so Super Ocho. But Caramel Chip's been in pretty good form. I know both of those races were over sloppy tracks, but this is a dangerous barn, and if when they get going well for this barn, sometimes they keep going well. You have to look past those sloppy track efforts and hope that he can translate it to a fast track. But I just think the pace setup is going to be in his favor. And if for some reason Nakatomi doesn't show up, then he could be there to pick up the pieces.
Yeah, from a running style standpoint, he's sort of the other horse that fits this race well. I have trouble getting too excited about him because just knowing some of the horses he's run against and the fields that he's been in, he has just faced much weaker competition than almost everybody else in this race. And I think that's a big function of why he was able to win all those races in 2023. His speed figures are consistent, though, and at least just on those numbers, he does fit here. He is one of those horses where my eyes scan over to the TimeformUS race rating column in RPPs and, compare it to today's race rating of 120. And he's just never been in a race that's gotten a race rating anywhere close to that. And that sort of is indicative of the horse that just is a little bit outclassed. But if the race does come apart, and if Nakatomi is maybe just not ready off the layoff or find some traffic trouble trying to close from last in this field, maybe it's a race that could fall into the lap of a horse like Caramel Chip, who doesn't seem like he's quite classy enough or good enough on former company coming into the race. And he does figure to be the right price in here with a good rider on his back. So I'm not gonna knock anybody who wants to go in that direction. I can certainly understand the case.
Yeah, he would just be my other horse. I wouldn't spend too much money in against Nakatomi, but that would be the other. I would have to play that scenario.
Yeah, the other horse that I would look at is Super Ocho, who obviously has a lot stacked against him from a pace standpoint, but at least he's a horse who's shown a lot of talent. He's run against some tough competition before. I don't know what version of Miles Ahead was showing up at their Fairgrounds 2 back, because I don't think we've seen that horse too often, but I'm not going to hold Super Ocho losing to that one against him too much, because that horse just freaked that day. And Super Ocho, he's run pretty well in surrounding races. It's just tough to view him as a likely winner of this race, given how much other speed is signed on and the way that he has to run seemingly to be successful. Let's move on to the middle leg of this sequence. It is a maiden special weight event for the 3-year-old fillies. This one going 1 mile and a 16th on the turf course. And this is kind of a mean race to card right in the middle of the sequence. I know that they probably wanted to move the Suncoast Stakes out of the pick 5, since it figures to have a heavy favorite in there, that Todd Pletcher horse, whose name is escaping me now, the one who won the Demoiselle. But we've got this maiden special weight with lightly raced horses, first-time starters, and it's just hard to have this race right in the middle of a sequence and feel confident about it. I guess at the very least, you could say the first-time starters do go out for some barns that have had success doing this. So maybe if you want to, you could have a little more confidence in a few of them showing up. Particularly, I think the one that you have to develop an opinion about is the number 9, Oversubscribed, who is going out for connections that we've seen have success in very similar races like this in big days at Tampa in the past. That's, of course, Klarovich Stables and Chad Brown. Chad seems to unveil plenty of nice turf maidens at Tampa Bay Downs at this time of year, especially as he's sort of shifted his program for lightly raced horses more to Tampa than Gulfstream during the winter in recent years. Oversubscribed, I mean, they bought her overseas, like a lot of these horses with European pedigrees. She's well-bred, and not going to be a surprise when she's a runner.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty amazing the money Chad Brown takes, that he can still have a positive ROI over the past 5 years with first-time starters and turf routes at Tampa. 36% with a $2.05 ROI. So, I mean, she's a must-use for me, especially with the fact that, we don't have much other information to go on. Not really much in terms of the workout report or workout videos that I could find as of recently. The only thing that she has taken a long time to get to the races. It looks like she was working back at Saratoga, and then they had to stop on her, and then tried to then it's been working pretty consistently, maybe a little bit on and off since the end of November into December. But these Chad Brown trainees are just so dangerous, and it's a pose at your own peril, especially in this type of race.
Yeah, typically I would be looking to play against first-time starters at short prices in almost any situation, but you cite those stats. I looked them up as well. They're convincing, and we've just seen it over the years on these days at Tampa, Chad Brown typically sends out some live firsters, and these top barns that they have a lot of firsters they can choose to debut at any given time. They typically save the better ones for the big racing days. We see that with Todd Pletcher. We see that with the Brad Coxes, the barns that have a whole stable of horses that are maybe ready to go and make their their debuts at a given time. Typically, a horse like Oversubscribed, you can have some confidence that they can run a little bit. Chad Brown does have two horses in this race, and obviously it seems like she is the more live of the two. I personally didn't see Stenson Statins do too much running when she ran at Saratoga last year, and Tyler Gaffalione is just more of a rider that Chad Brown uses regularly. He's on Oversubscribed instead. As far as the pedigree goes, I mean, not that it matters too much, because I think we can assume this one's well-bred. They bought her at Tattersall's for $481,000. Actually, I believe it was Tattersall's. I didn't write down the auction site, but that's how much they bought her for. The Dam is half to a horse that was Group 1 placed in Europe. The Dam herself, she was a stakes winner on turf. So, I mean, just feels like a horse that probably will have some ability. There are other first-time starters in this race, and there's one in particular I wanted to mention, and that's the number 5, Bell of Rights, who's going out for Shug McGahee. And Shug is not nearly as prolific a debut trainer as Chad Brown, but he's another trainer who does tend to send out live runners to Tampa Bay Downs, and he certainly has been taking advantage of that this year. He's going to get, I think, 50% at this point in the meet, and this horse, I could only find one workout video of her on XBTV, and it was the workout 2 back on January 27th, and it was just a 4 furlong drill in 51 seconds. And it's, if you're not a horse person or somebody who works with horses day in and day out, it's hard to read a lot into a slow workout like that, because you really do have to pay attention to the horse's action and body language. And I'll admit that I'm not the greatest expert on those things. I only really know what I know through just watching as many workouts as I do, which is a lot. But I mean, it's a different thing than actually working with the horses and knowing things about their conformation. I will say, to my eye, Bell of Rights looked like a better horse than the one she was working in company with in that workout. She was just going a little easier, especially on the gallop out of that work. And I liked the way she was moving. How much quality she has is a little tough to read, but she's got pedigree by Constitution, who's a good first out sire, a sire that can really get horses to do anything. And it's a strong Dam side pedigree. I mean, the Dam was a 2-time turf winner, and the Dam's actually a full sister to Verrazano, who was a really nice horse, could run well on dirt and turf. So Bell of Rights is one that just figures to be a better price than Oversubscribed, because I think people just assume that the Chad Brown horse is going to be successful in spots like this. And maybe a Shug McGahee horse that on a normal day would take more money could drift up in price a little bit. We'll see how that works out. But she's the other one that I'd be looking to use in this spot.
Yeah, she would be the other firster for me. I think the other two, the number 3 for Arnaud Delacour and the number 6 for Our Prayer, are a little bit harder to make. But I did want to at least give some some chance to two of the horses that have already run before. The number 8 Gossiper, maybe if these other two firsters that we already mentioned take a lot of money, she could float up off of that 9-2 morning line. And while on paper it doesn't look like she did a ton of running in the debut, didn't take a ton of money either. She seemed like a horse that was still figuring it out. Kind of running in not necessarily running in spots, but high action, high head carriage, kind of trying to just look like she needed a start. And that race was relatively productive. Style Points, the winner, came back to run second in the Swedish Chant. So she's one that I would want to at least keep on side in my pick 5 play. But my top pick is going to be the number 2, Lucevan La Stelle. I don't know how well my Italian is going to translate in podcast form, but that's the best I've got. And I just think that this is a move for Tom Albatrani that I've had success with in the past. And it's, second time starters on the turf for him often take a big step forward. He's not known for having them cranked up first time out. And that trip last time was not ideal. I mean, being 3 to 4 wide around pretty much the entire track is always going to be tough. I mean, the winner and the second place finisher kind of ran away from the rest of the field. But like she had a reason to get tired. A, because of the trip, and B, because it was a first time out for a barn that doesn't necessarily win with that move. Albatrani's stats are he hits at a relatively 16% with this type of move, but the ROI is off the charts. Hit with a couple of long shots recently, Quokka last year at Aqueduct, and then Hail 2 is the two that come to mind off the top of my head. It's just this move exactly, and you never know what you're going to get with these first time starters, and they're going to take the money that we expect them to. So if this horse is kind of in that 8 to 10 to 1 range, I think she's worth at least a play, and this is kind of one of the places where I'm going to focus in on in the pick 5.
Yeah, I think you bring up a couple of interesting horses there. Gossiper, it's funny that you brought up the way she runs. I mean, watching her race, she kind of reminded me of like a mini Warlike Goddess. She's got a lot of those same attributes to her head carriage and the way that she moves. And maybe that means that she's a horse that's ultimately going to want to go a little bit longer. I mean, she is a daughter of English Channel, just like Warlike Goddess, going out for the same connection. So maybe I'm just seeing what I want to see there. But I mean, I do think that she's got a bit of that look to her. I wanted to see her do a little more running in that race, especially towards the end, but it was just a first start. And Bill Mott, he does a lot better with first time starters these days than he did maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, but primarily with dirt sprinters and on turf routers, they sometimes do need a start. So you could see her taking a step forward. Like you, I'd be a little more interested in the 2, Lucia von Lestelle, who's the other second time starter you mentioned. Love her name. It's just somebody who's an opera fan. That's a famous aria from Tosca, and it's a little weird that that's the name of her, and she's drawn right alongside a horse who's out of a dam, Lucia von. It's a very, very obscure reference, and they're drawn right alongside of each other. But as far as the number 2 goes, that Tom Albertrani runner, I agree. It was not an ideal trip first time out. It looked like it could have been a good learning experience for her. She took no money that day. She's actually a horse that had been entered at Aqueduct last year in the fall. One of the many days, I believe, that got rained off the turf, didn't get to race. She might have even been entered twice. So she had been ready to run for a while, and they ultimately debuted at Tampa and just felt like the typical Tom Albertrani runner, as you were saying, that probably needed a start, could do better second time out. I wish that seemed like a race that had a little more promise in it that she's exiting, because the top 2 finishers, I don't think they're that much. Watchtower and Mayfly, they both had plenty of experience coming in there, hadn't run that well. And, they maybe got a higher speed figure than you would have imagined given their form coming into that race. But I think this is the horse that you do want out of that race if you're watching it back. So she's definitely one that I could upgrade a little bit.
Yeah, that was pretty much it for me in that race. I mean, did you make anything of the number 7 active? That was the other horse that had run a little bit. I just don't really normally love gun runners on the turf, and I feel like the fact that they never even gave her a shot on the dirt is maybe a little bit indicative of her overall quality. And but she was the only other horse that I could even maybe make a case for outside of the ones that we've already discussed.
Yeah, I mean, for me, having a gun runner in your stable and debuting it on the turf probably isn't a great sign, just kind of knowing what we know about how the gun runners have performed. And I only watched one of her races, just the turf route 2 back, and she kind of ran the way it looks on paper. I mean, she tried to make a move and was just very one-paced at the end. So I didn't see enough to want to take her in this race, and it just felt like there were others who had a lot more upside than she did. Let's move on to the feature race of this sequence, the 10th on the card. It is the Grade 3 Sam F. Davis. This one going 1 mile and a 16th for the 3-year-olds. Obviously, this race was supposed to feature the 3-year-old debut of Locked, who would have been a heavy favorite along the same lines as Fierceness last week in the Holy Bull. Unfortunately, Locked came down with the temperature, won't be running this week. Hopefully he gets back onto the work tab very soon. But without Locked running, the size of this field has clearly increased. More connections willing to take a shot in this race, and it really does feel like some of them are just taking a shot at a Derby prep, because there definitely is some filler in this field. But it turns it into a much more interesting race to handicap, because a couple of the horses that could vie for favoritism in here, they don't stand on the most solid ground. And I think that's particularly true of probably the fill-in for locked in this race, the number 6 Agate Road for the Todd Pletcher barn, who I've got some major questions about transitioning back to the dirt here. I know he debuted on the dirt and ran okay to lose by a nose, but since then he's been campaigned as a turf horse, and they're just taking a shot on the dirt here at a Derby prep. I don't blame them for it because there's really no major turf races and you're missing at the time of the year to take a shot in this kind of race. But Michael, I don't know about you. This is the kind of horse that I never want to take a short price on.
Yeah, the way I looked at him a little bit was like almost best case scenario is if you cover up the surface of his races and just assume they were all on dirt. Even in that case, like looking at the speed figures he's run, I still don't think he would be anywhere near deserving favoritism just off of those races, even if they were on dirt and they were on turf. And he may be bred for dirt a little bit with Yellow Agate being the Frizette winner from a few years back. But you know, you would think that Todd Pletcher knows what a dirt horse would look like and would probably try to get him on dirt earlier, especially when he's ready at that stage of this two-year-old year. This seems like a shot and a significant underlay at that. I mean, I can't be as against the number 9 Change of Command, especially with how the Shug McGahee barn is going at Tampa right now. But I do think that there's a little bit of this, I think a little bit of a narrative around this horse that he's just going to improve with the blinkers. And I don't know if that's something I want to be taking a short price on necessarily. And I don't really feel like I would want to take a super short price on anyone in this race. You know, this move has worked okay for Shug in the past. He has 3 times first time blinkers, had a stakes winner, General Jim, first captain, and Pink Sands, but he's never done it off of a win last out for whatever that's worth. And he's also going to have to come off Lasix for this race, which is something that, you know, it's certainly not a positive. It can be a neutral position, but I don't think you can say it's a positive with his last start being on it. So I mean, I was looking in other directions, but those 2 favorites are definitely probably where a lot of the action will center around.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that they're 2 fairly obvious horses in an otherwise very confusing race, so I could see them taking plenty of money in here. And I do think Change of Command is going to be the favorite over Agate Road, and we'll see how short he ultimately goes off, because, I mean, his form is more exposed, and he's more of the obvious horse that you would envision on the Derby trail, given his connections and how much money they paid for him. And in these Derby preps, I think the horses that are easy to picture entering the Derby trail tend to take a little more money than maybe they should, because you do have a lot of people tuning in just for these races as opposed to the entire card on big days like this. Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add about your sentiments on Agate Road. The one thing I'll say is I've watched some of his dirt workouts. I remember watching some of his dirt workouts last summer at Saratoga, and then recently the videos that are available. And to me, he just doesn't move as well in the dirt. He didn't work as well as Cardinale when they worked together in December. He kind of worked heads up with Noted in January, but I don't know if that's really a good sign given the way Noted ran last weekend. So, he's just not for me in this race. It's a total experiment, and I would need a big price that I'm not getting on him. As for Change of Command, yeah, it's a little weird they're adding the blinkers off a win. I guess the impetus for that is that he seemed to idle a little bit once he made the lead in the stretch last time, and maybe the blinkers would have focused him more, though to me it didn't seem like he was necessarily a horse that was pulling himself up. My big concern with Change of Command is I don't know how far he really wants to go. He got the mile on the 16th last time with a short stretch. Maybe he does it again here, though it seems like this race could feature a slightly more competitive pace situation. And I don't know what adding the blinkers is going to do to his impact on that. But to me, it's just enough of a variable with a horse that's going to be a short price that I don't want to rely on him too heavily. Between the 2 favorites, I prefer him, and I'm not going to be surprised that he wins this race. He's just not the kind of horse I'd ever want to bet on. So I wanted to look elsewhere. I imagine you'll have a positive take on this horse too, so I'll just bring him up and throw it over to you. But I think kind of arguably the horse to beat in this race, when you sort of take into account his recent form and the trouble he had last time, is the number 7 Copper Tax. because this horse did nothing but win races last year at Delaware and Laurel and overcame adversity, used different running styles, and they took a big shot at the Remsen last time. And in retrospect, they just had an impossible task when he drew the 9 post, just given the way the track was playing on Cigar Mile Day when that race was run. And, the trip was maybe even worse than they could have imagined because he was legitimately 5 wide around the clubhouse turn. And beyond that, they tried to send him a little bit to get forward. That backfired because then he got too keen and rank. And he just never had a chance to get inside that day. And it's not like he completely threw in the towel. He actually finished a little bit. So based on that performance, I think Copper Tax is actually one of the more likely winners of this race.
Yeah, I would agree. I think he's the horse to beat, and he's going to be around 5-1, or no, maybe not the horse to beat. I think the horse to beat is still change of command, but I think Copper Tax is right there with him, and is probably going to be twice the price. Against the bias last time out, plus that race has proven pretty competitive. Drum roll, please, came back to win the Jerome. Domestic Product came back to win second, and I know there's a couple of horses that were also ran decent in the Swale last weekend. So that race has been productive against the track. I would think I don't know how much I want to upgrade the performance in terms of, I know he was against the track and he did a little running at the end, but he still did lose by 14 lengths. So I think it's more of a draw a line through or excuse race and then kind of judge him based on the rest of his form, which makes him, right there with the favorites and at a better price. So I think he's definitely a must use. But there's 2 other horses that I really want to focus in on. And I'll leave the second one for maybe for you to talk about a little bit, and then we can discuss. But the horse that I really want to focus in a lot of my play on is the number 12 Elysian Meadows. And I'm reading a little bit into trainer intent when I am out of my depth to do so. But this horse, the fact that Mott brought this horse south for the winter could mean one of 2 things. On the negative side, it could mean he knows this horse is bred for turf, and eventually it will end up on turf. There's no turf racing in New York during this time of year, at being a New York bred. So had to move down south to get on the turf there. But that's not where they're running the first time. They're running in a Derby prep. So I feel like that's a positive sign that Mott would have that type of maybe they're just taking a shot, but have that type of the confidence in this horse. The second thing would be, I think distance is going to be his friend. He debuted going 6.5, showed a versatile running style, so able to sit back, make a move, and then even showed the talent to come back at 6 and still win right back and beat Mischief Joke, who came back to win the Rego Park with an improved speed figure. So even though the speed figures are low, I think you can project some improvement from A, that race being relatively live, B, getting more distance. And I just think that there's something interesting to be said about Mott running him here when there's lucrative stakes opportunities up in New York on the dirt. The Rego Park is a perfect example of a race that Mott could have run in, but instead they're down here. Now, like I said, it could be the turf situation because they're really bred on the dam side for turf, and City of Light can be pretty versatile. But the stretch out and distance I like. Maybe it's asking a little bit too much, but the price should be right on Elysian Meadows. And I think the way the pace could set up with Patriot Spirit having to go a little bit, change of control with the blinkers, I think there's a possibility that Junior Alvarado can kind of negotiate a trip out of the 12 hole, which isn't ideal, but that's also going to be factored into the price as well. Some people may be put off based on the post. So that's where I landed. And I hope we get a fair price on Elysian Meadows. 15-1 seems a little bit optimistic, but I would take anything above probably 6 or 7-1.
Yeah, I think you could get double digits. I was thinking somewhere in the 10-1 range on him, and it sounds like that's fair for you. I'm not quite sure what to do with him, and I totally get taking an optimistic view with a horse like this. And it's easy to make the case that his last race is a little better than it looks, with Mischief Joke coming back to improve. And Mischief Joke is a horse that at times has a little hang in him, so I don't want to give Elysian Meadows too much credit for holding him off, but I did like that progression from start 1 to start 2, showing that improved tactical speed, and he's still figuring things out. When you watch that last race, he was hanging on his left lead until the 8th pole, and he switched over late, so there could be further improvement with him. And, I looked up a stat for Bill Mott that actually surprised me a little bit, because I expected it to be a negative stat. It actually was leaning more in the positive direction, and that is horses trying a route for the first time that are non, I think I looked it up, non-maidens, first time route in dirt stakes races. He's 6 for 21. It's a 29% win rate, and the ROI, it's just below positive. It's 191, but I was kind of expecting that to not be a good Bill Mott stat, and he's actually done it fairly successfully. And this horse actually reminds me a lot of a horse that was almost successful, making, I'm not sure it was a similar move because he might have gone a mile before, but a horse that was in New York bred shipping up after 2 starts to run in a Derby prep. And that was Shadow Dragon last year, who was second at a big price in, I believe it was the Fountain of Youth. So Elysian Meadows has a similar look to that kind of horse. And I agree with what you're saying about the pedigree. It does look more turf. I think that's one of the big reasons why he was such a big price on debut. And I could see, based on the way he runs, ultimately transitioning to the turf, but they nominated him to the Triple Crown. They're running here. So I think you're probably reading correctly into that they want to give this a good shot. We'll see if he is good enough and if he can overcome that outside post position. I was looking at some other horses that were more locally based. Well, really one in particular, I wanted to focus on that January 14th allowance race that was run at Tampa Bay Downs. That was won by Crazy Mason over Fulmineo. Watching that race back, I recorded a preview for DRF yesterday, handicapping this race, and I probably undersold the trip of Fulmineo just a little bit. I'll mention him first. He's a horse who did break legitimately a length slowly that day, and he had to do some work into the first turn to get up into position, and he was always out in the clear and sort of steadily advanced as they were just crawling up front. And I guess you could make the argument that he moved a little bit too soon. I think just based on traditional trip handicapping, that's a fair way to look at Fulmineo. From my perspective, they were going so slowly in the early stages of that race. I don't know how much of an imposition it really was to move up gradually from about 3 lengths off the pace to be, heads up with the leaders by the time they got, to the far turn run. I was a little more impressed with Crazy Mason because he was held up behind the pace, getting a pretty good trip. I mean, he was saving ground, but that was a race that just turned into a full-on sprint to the wire, and Crazy Mason was the horse that really showed the kick through the stretch. Yeah, he got that covered up trip and angled out to do so, but I really liked the way he finished off that race, and just looking at Crazy Mason's form overall, I like the way he finishes almost every time. He was really taking a good shot at Patriot Spirit 2 back, going a distance that just seems like it's a little bit on the short side for Crazy Mason these days. I even thought, speaking of Copper Tax again, his rocky run back in October of last year at Delaware, I don't think the gap in ability between these horses is as much as the 8 lengths that Copper Tax beat Crazy Mason by that day, because Copper Tax had everything his own way in that rocky run, setting the pace on a muddy track and just coasting along up front. The exact way that you want to try to stretch out in distance when you're stretching out for the first time. Whereas Crazy Mason was out of position. I don't know if being right down on the inside was where you wanted to be. He was trying to advance up the rail. Seemed like a horse that was reacting badly to the kickback. He was climbing a bit in the early stages, but he still kept trying. He never gave up to finish 3rd that day. And I just think this horse has shown hints of ability and he hasn't quite put it all together yet in a race that is truly set up for him. I mean, I love the way he finished off, leveled off and finished last time, but that wasn't a race that really set up for him to run a big speed figure. So I'm not going to worry too much about the numbers that he's got, in the speed figure column coming into this race. And to me, he just seems like a horse that's primed to take a step forward with a better pace setup. And I think he might get it here.
Yeah, this is the interesting thing about trip handicapping is I was probably in the camp of Fulmineo off of those trips. And, you make a really good case for Crazy Mason. I just thought that the start put him a few more lengths behind the 8 ball than what is captured in the chart comment. And so I felt like going into the first turn, the difference between Crazy Mason and Fulmineo was probably close to 5 lengths. And then he made that big run like wide around to kind of get into the race, which from a pace perspective probably put him in a better tactical position coming into the turn, but he did have to expend that energy and that ground loss to get into that position. And I think that's ultimately what caught up to him in the final 16th of a mile. I don't know what necessarily those two were beating that day, but it's good to see that they pulled well clear of the third place finisher. And for me, Fulmineo is kind of the he's similar to Agate Road, but he's the main difference, and it's a very important difference, is he should be 5 times the price. I mean, if you cover up his turf races and ignore and imagine them as dirt races, then him and Agate Road look relatively similar. And so, I mean, I think that dirt is ultimately going to be I think he's probably going to be a pretty versatile horse where he can run on either surface. And I just thought that, I read a little bit differently that trip for him versus Crazy Mason, who I think that there's not too much separating them in overall talent for me. So I would kind of use Crazy Mason as well, but more of a backup and focus in on mainly Elysian Meadows, but Fulmineo was another one that I wanted to use.
Yeah, I totally get looking at Fulmineo that way. And I probably, I could convince myself to look at it that way too, because typically I would want to upgrade the Fulmineo trip a little bit more. I guess I was trying to think about what kind of trips they're going to get in this particular race. And I think that was one of the reasons why I ultimately started to sway more in the direction of Crazy Mason, because when I watched Fulmineo's 2 dirt races, he drew the outside post both times. He never had to deal with even a moment of kickback in those races. They just kind of kept him out in the clear. And while he's drawn outside in this race, it's a 12-horse field, and he doesn't have the speed to get forward. And if they try to save any ground in this race, he's probably going to have to deal with kickback on the dirt for the first time. And I wonder a little bit about that, because even though he's running the dirt, I feel like this is going to be a new situation for Fulmineo, whereas Crazy Mason, that's not really a concern for me. He's had a lot more experience on the dirt. He's gotten different kind of trips, different tracks. And I just trust him a little bit more to back up that performance from last time. So that's kind of the other factor that was swaying me in the direction of Crazy Mason, but we'll see what kind of prices these horses are. I kind of get the sense they could be similar prices in this race. But Fulmineo, the point you make about him relative to Agate Road is well taken. I think you would much rather want to take him than a horse like Agate Road in a similar situation.
Exactly. I mean, I think this race is just pretty much the crux of the sequence, especially because we both kind of share the opinion that we're against the 2 favorites, one more so than the other. But this is kind of what makes the sequence playable if you're inclined to do so, is trying to hone in on 1 or 2 of these prices and try to get them home.
100%. I don't know if there's anybody else you want to mention in this race. I think we covered a lot of ground. There was really nobody else that I had to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, I would say Patriot Spirit could be a little dangerous if they leave him alone on the front end. He's got enough pedigree to get the distance. I just viewed that there will be enough pace with the big field, change of control, adding blinkers. And then the other horse that kind of scares me a little bit, just because the barn is such a high percentage and they can win. They win a lot down here, is the number 5, No More Time. But ultimately I couldn't get there just off of, I don't think that the Mucho Macho Man was the greatest race of the world. Some of the horses that ran back in the Holy Bull last weekend didn't really flatter it too much, but this is a dangerous barn, and his race 2 back was that's a competitive speed figure, and he had some excuses in the Mucho Macho Man. I just thought it was a relatively slow race.
Yeah, we have similar feelings about those too. Well, let's close things out with the last leg of this sequence, and it's not an easy way to end things. This is a 1 mile allowance N1X for the fillies and mares, and we drew another large field. We've got 12 runners signed on for this one, and this is it's a tricky race, because I think your eye is immediately drawn to the number 3 Royalty Interest, who is one of those Chad Brown horses that we were referring to earlier. I mean, they debuted her, I believe that was Tampa Bay Derby Day last year. She won the last race on the card and did so impressively. But what do we get from her now as she comes back off this layoff? They only ran her 1 more time last year in the Penn Oaks. And I think 2 things are true about that race. she got a terrible ride and trip. I mean, that was IRAT-RT just kind of stuck her out in the 3 path in no man's land, no cover. It's not a successful trip on the turf. At the same time, she was the 4-5 favorite, and even though there was no pace signed on, she was awful that day. I mean, she had nothing to offer through the stretch. And now we haven't seen her in a long time. She's coming back in this seemingly soft allowance race at Tampa, but I think that's going to ensure that once again, she's a very short price. I'm not quite sure what to do with her in this race, but I do know she's not the kind of horse that I would want to take at 9-5, 8-5 if that's the kind of price she is.
Yeah, she's a tough call for me. I feel like these Chad Brown horses just win. Like the way to come back at Tampa, they've had some time off, and then they come back and win at very, very short prices. I mean, he hits at, I think this horse is probably, in my opinion, I think this horse is about 40% to win this race. And so I get that it's tough for me to reconcile that opinion with the rest of the sequence, just because I feel like looking at this race, a lot of people are going to default here, especially in the pick 5. You've handicapped the whole sequence. You get to the last race, 12-horse field. Outside of her, a lot of them look the same. You're like, I'll just take the Chad Brown and move on. And so I definitely think there's a chance that she's an underlay in the pick 5. I think she's going to get bet down off of the 2-1 morning line. But these horses win. And I don't know how many more times Chad Brown's going to be sending horses to Penn for that card. I think a lot of times you get pretty wonky results there. I know there was one year that they had a bog, and wow, what a summer beat Annapolis. But Chad Brown's had some horses on firm days, boggy days, that didn't show up on that turf course. I think of Haughty, I think, ran there. Maybe one other one that I'm missing, but and so I'm willing to forgive that effort completely. And in Chad Brown, I trust for this one. The thing that I don't love about this opinion is that it's one that is going to be shared with the vast majority of pick 5 players. There's going to be some underlay opportunity there, but I just think this horse is very likely to win.
If I'm going to poke a further hole in this horse, and I kind of want to get your take on whether you think this is important or not. We talked about an earlier race where Chad Brown had 2 runners in there, and we sort of agreed that, or at least I kind of said you agreed, and you didn't. You didn't.
I agree with this point. Yes.
Well, he had 2 riders. Tyler Gaffalione was riding the Klarovich horse, and Vincent Cheminot was riding the horse that you didn't bring up. I brought up briefly and said I didn't think she was a contender. Is it at all interesting that Tyler does not have a mount in this race, and Chad Brown is putting a jockey that he almost never uses on this horse? I don't know. Maybe Tyler has early dinner reservations and he doesn't want to stick around to ride this race, but is that at least a mild concern that maybe this isn't a horse that they have high hopes for?
I think you could read it that way. I mean, I also feel like Chad Brown, all of his jockeys, they kind of started as Cheminot at some point. I think of Manny Franco. I think of, Flavian Pratt a little bit, but he was kind of more established when Chad Brown started putting him on his good ones. And so, this could be an opportunity for Cheminot to show that he can ride these types of horses for Chad in Tampa, or, maybe when Chad ships a horse to Colonial during the summer, like he could ride him. I think that I could read it that way as well. I mean, I don't know how much time we should spend reading into this, because there's a lot of factors that we could be unaware of. Honestly, like Tyler Gaffalione wanting to get back to a home base, it could be a perfectly logical reason why he's not on the horse too. So I think that's how I read into it. You could go either way.
Yeah, I typically don't like to read too much into jockey assignments, and we kind of glossed over a jockey assignment that people might ask us about in the prior race, Sam F. Davis, that also involves Tyler, where he's taking over from Jose Ortiz on a change of command, and Jose has a different mount in the race. That's because Jose was already committed to locked, and they already lined up Tyler for change of command, and that jockey switch, while locked, was still supposed to run in the race. So just in case people are confused by that rider switch, there often is something else like that going on. I don't see an obvious reason that an obvious explanation like that in this race, but it's just something that at least it crossed my mind. It's not the most important factor for me in this race because I think there's a lot of other stuff to talk about, but it crossed my mind. I'm looking to beat a favorite like this, and maybe I can't get there based on the competition, but just coming into this race when I started handicapping it, I thought to myself, I want to try to beat this horse, and I started to look at some others. One horse, I'll just lead with the horse that I'm most interested in this race, and that would be the number 5 Artifact. This is a horse who has raced on synthetic and turf, more so synthetic recently, or at least the last time we saw her in the summer of last year. But overall, while she does have one nice race on synth against claimers, I think her turf form is slightly better. And I thought she ran pretty well, especially in that pair of turf races in May of last year at Gulfstream when she won that starter allowance and then came back and finished a decent 4th, not that far behind Soviet Excess, who has since proven to be a stakes quality horse for Todd Pletcher through the summertime. And her last couple of races were not great, but it just seemed like she tailed off a little bit, and she'd been racing consistently since the start of her career, and they gave her some time away. Now she's returning for a new barn, a barn in Anthony Ferraro, who has great numbers coming off layoffs. I looked it up specifically, 150 to 300 day layoffs over the past 5 years. He's 20 for 94, 21% with a $3.06 ROI, getting a live rider assignment for the return in Sammy Camacho, another jockey that Chad Brown loves to use at Tampa that's not riding his horse. And I just think this one has some upside because let's remember, the only races that we've seen from her are up until the midpoint of her 3-year-old season. And you typically would expect horses to continue improving throughout their 3-year-old season into the 4-year-old season. So with just routine improvement, I think that this one could take a step forward. And then my eyes sort of glance over to the owner's box, and even though this horse is going out for a trainer we wouldn't really think about them using, this is a Reeves Thoroughbreds horse. And Reeves Thoroughbreds, they're kind of like the super trainers of the owner's world. I mean, they win at a crazy high rate. And I always want to pay attention when they are using a trainer that maybe you wouldn't expect them to. So to me, Artifact, I think she's a big price on the line. What is she, 12 to 1? I don't know if she's going to be that high, but she is the most interesting alternative for me in a race where I don't think she's going to be that short given how much money I expect the Chad Brown favorite to attract.
Yeah, I think definitely, especially the way I think they're going to bet the Chad Brown horse. I mean, everyone's going to see the same thing I saw, and you know, her debut on this card, I thought that was a relatively live race and she buried that field. So it's very obvious. So I think they could go overboard a little bit. And 12 to 1 is, I would say, very likely, if not more, on Artifact, especially with kind of how similar a lot of the other horses look. You know, the one horse that I think is a little bit of a trap is the number 6 Apropos. And, you know, I feel like, you know, people are going to see the turf works and they're fast, you know, and new face switching to the turf. You know, got Mendelson on the top, you know, but I just don't. I think she should just be slow, and you need to be a little bit faster to win a race like this. And I don't think she's going to be any great price. That she's second choice on the morning line. She could easily go off that. And the other thing that I thought was interesting is that the turf work last time was fast, 46 and 2, but it was also the 11th fastest of 57. So there was something going on with that turf course at Palm Meadows that day that there were some fast work times. So that could get, you know, factored into the price too. And I didn't, you know, normally Jimmy Toner's horses have some fantastic, you know, that Phillips family turf pedigree, but I didn't really see that as much with this horse. So I think that was another reason why, you know, just kept going back to the Chad horse, because that was one I feel like could be a trap for some people. Did you view her the same way?
Yeah, I mean, I always am drawn to horses like this, trying to make a case for a new face in the race, and sometimes that new face is the horse trying to surface for the first time. But we saw a lot of the same things here. I wish I could have found a workout video for any of those turf works. They were on XB TV, and the most recent one that has that really fast clocking, that was a day where the at least according to the printed form, the dogs were down and they were able to race right on the rail. And which you follow Palmetto's workouts, that's when you see those crazy fast times. And it's just a turf course that plays extremely fast. So I don't want to make too much of raw times. I really want to see the workouts at Palmetto's rather than just take those workout times at face value. So I don't know if she has any turf inclination. Obviously, they've been planning this for a while with all of those turf workouts. I mean, they clearly want to find out if she can handle this surface, but I think that's primarily because she's been a little bit of a disappointment on the dirt. You got to go down to the second dam to find turf pedigree. I mean, her second dam Pinch Pie was a grade 3 place turf horse. She did win on the turf, but I mean, it's not overwhelming turf pedigree by any means. And watching even that sloppy sealed track race when she broke her maiden, I was looking for some hint of like a turf action with her, and I could see her transitioning to it, but it wasn't like she was, hitting me over the head, like saying this is a turf horse. So at what could be the second choice or third choice in this race, she wasn't one I could get too excited about. I'll just mention some others. It sounds like I'm a little more interested in looking in other directions in this race. I gave a look to the number 8, Embrace Me. I get the sense that she's one who does want more ground, and maybe this is just a starting point for a Tom Labertrani trainee where they're looking a little further down the line. But at least she was really coming into her own at the end of last season. Some of the speed figure improvement is just a function of the races that she was in. I think that's the case last time when she really wasn't in the same league as a horse like Arcali Kim. She was just happened to be in the same race as her. But two back, I mean, she was running on pretty well at the end of that mile and 3/16 race. Got some pace to close into, but the horses that finished right around her would all be contenders in this spot. So I don't want to totally dismiss her, and she should be a fair price in this race. And then to her outside, I watched a bunch of the replays of the number 9 Classic Vinyl. I wish I saw a little more finish from her. She's just kind of one of those one-paced grinder types. I don't know if she's going to get the right pace set up in this race. So I was on the fence about her. And the one horse I could make a case for at a really big price, I'll just double check the line. I think she is 15 to 1. But I think she'll be even higher than that. Is the number 10, Maria's Revenge, who has primarily been on synthetic for the majority of her recent races. But when I go back and isolate some of her turf races, they're really not that bad. I mean, the field that she faced in December of 22, the last time that she was on the turf, it was a decent group. She was 36 to 1 for a reason. I mean, Tequilera and Regal Realm, they would be strong favorites in a race like this, especially Regal Realm. And that was a race that, she just didn't really have a chance to make a run from the back of the pack. Going all the way back to, towards the beginning of 2022, she faced, tough males in a maiden race and actually closed pretty well on April 17th of 22 when she got a decent speed figure. Recently, she's been on synthetic and she's okay on the synth. Her form seems like maybe it's tailed off a little bit. There were some layoffs towards the beginning of last season. She's been gigantic prices in her recent races, but she's coming out of a race that was just a total merry-go-round. She had no chance to close, and still her numbers stack up against this field fairly favorably, and she's getting a live rider switch for this race to Antonio Gallardo, and she's just going to be a huge price in a race where I don't think anybody is that formidable, and she's the kind of horse I could use as a B or C on a pick 5 ticket because I think she's going to add a lot of value.
Yeah, I think this speaks to how, and like after you get past royalty interest, there's a lot of horses that you can make cases for out if you take her out of the race. And for me, the way I thought about this race, and I really love the way you do your analysis on the Naira website, where you put your 1, 2, 3, 4 picks up there, but you're really focused on writing about the races where you have an opinion that you think represents value. For me, this would be a race where I would put my 1, 2, 3, 4 picks up. I would put number 3 on top. I would put 3 horses behind her, and I probably wouldn't write a word about the race because that's kind of my opinion on it. I think that the horse that, for what it's worth, the horse that I probably would have put second in a 1, 2, 3, 4 picks would be the number 12 Double Cosmo Girl. Just because I thought the trip last time, you could make a case that it wasn't ideal. Still ran on well to finish second. Diamond Hands is an okay turf horse. Not necessarily sure what form she's in right now, but it was good enough to win that allowance race, wide around the turn. But she has a 12 post today too, and that's going to be really, really difficult, especially with the type of trip I would project to her to get versus royalty interest well drawn on the inside.
Yeah, and the one thing we didn't discuss about this race is that a lot of the horses we're talking about they want to come from off the pace, and there really doesn't appear to be a ton of speed in here. Maybe that makes the number 1 Serious Light dangerous. Watching her races and just looking at her pedigree, I have trouble seeing her getting better with more ground, but I think that's at least a factor that you want to consider, and maybe that's another reason to be afraid of Royalty Interest, because at least she's got the tactical speed to get somewhat forward and maybe sit in the pocket in this race. So I don't think you want to totally ignore the pace in a race where you start to see yourself making a case for a lot of horses with similar running styles, and I saw myself doing that here. So not an easy way to end the sequence. I think that wraps up the handicapping portion. Michael, you know the drill. Let's talk about how we might play the sequence if we go after it. This is not the easiest ticket to put together, but I'll let you go first just to kind of rehash some of the horses you would want to use.
Yeah, I'll kind of go in a loose DRF ticket maker form. For me, in the first race, the Minaret, I would use the 3 and the 4 Unifying and Lady Rattler as A's. I would use the number 1 Dream Concert as a B, and I would use the number 2 Chi-Town Lady as a C, and basically meaning that I would need to be right everywhere else on the ticket, especially with some of my longer price horses that I like, for Chi-Town Lady to be able to pay off in the pick 5 sequence. I wanted to add some other horses. I wanted to make cases for some other horses, but I ultimately couldn't get there. In the 8th race, I'm going to lean on Nakatomi, but I also want to use the number 8 Caramel Chip, and then I would relegate the number 7 Sibelius to a backup. And then I will note that if either Dr. Oscar or Super Ocho scratch out, if there's some scratching changes, that would definitely change the pace scenario and change my opinion of this race. In the 9th race, I want to really upgrade the number 2 Lucha Von La Stelle. That would be kind of like a super A for me. And then the other A's would be the number 5 Bell of Rights, the number 9 Oversubscribed, and the number 8 Gossiper. And that's pretty much all I would need in that race. And then in the 10th race, the Sam F. Davis, I would make kind of my super A in this race, the number 12 Elysian Meadows. And then I would use the number 11 Fulmineo and the number 7 Copper Tax as my other A's. And then I would use the number 4 Crazy Mason as a B, and maybe the number 5 No More Time as a distant backup as a C. And then in the 11th race, to close it out, I would have probably about 90% of my play going through the number 3 Royalty Interest. And then I respect your opinion enough that I would throw in a bunch of those other backups on tickets with what I called my super A's for the previous parts of the sequence, trying to really land home a big score.
And for me, look, this is not a sequence that I feel great about. I'll kind of put that out there. I know we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording. It's not the easiest ticket to put together because I have to make choices in some races that I'm a little bit reluctant to make, particularly in that maiden race right in the middle of the sequence. But speaking about pick 5 structure, in that first leg, the Minaret, I'd probably use 2 A's, the 3 and the 4. Chi-Town Lady, more of a B, and then if I used C's in the race, kind of depending on how expensive this gets, they'd be horses like the 1 Dream Concert and the 6 Bazinga C, but I'd want most of my play to go through Unifying and Lady Rattler. In the Pelican, the 8th race, Nakatomi is the only A, and I'm not going to try to overcomplicate this one. Either you're for a horse like this or you're against him, and I'm going to be for this horse. So he'd be the only A, and then as more C types, I would consider horses like Super Ocho, Sibelius, and even Caramel Chip if this race holds together. But Michael makes a really good point about wanting to be flexible with your opinion if there are scratches, because sometimes you can get locked into these opinions and they're based on a pace scenario. And then when that pace scenario changes, you really do have to be nimble enough to update your view of the race. And this is one where if 1 or 2 speeds scratches out, it completely changes the complexion. In the 9th race, that maiden event, I don't think there's a great way to do this. I mean, I have an opinion that Bell of Rights could be a slightly better value than Oversubscribed. I agree with Michael about Lucha Von La Stelle. I don't know exactly how I'm supposed to split these up, so I kind of land in the direction of just using 3 A's in this race, which is not my preferred strategy, but I'm not exactly sure how else I'm supposed to do that if I'm playing this sequence. And then in the Sam F. Davis, I like Crazy Mason. He's definitely an A. I'm leaning towards using Copper Tax as a co-A because I think the point is well taken about if you just draw a line through his last race, he's not necessarily the horse to beat in the spot, but I still think he's going to be the right kind of price and better value than the other short prices. So there are my two ways. I could use Change of Command as a backup. I could use even Fulmineo as a bit more of a distant backup, but there are plenty of others in here that I just don't need to use at all. And then in the 11th race to close things out, tricky one to sort of sort from an ABC standpoint. Given my opinions about the value, I'm leaning towards just using 1A, and that being the number 5 Artifact, because I think she really is going to be the hook for me getting value out of this race. And then the others I would use in behind as backups would be Royalty Interest, who can win the race. And if I'm right in other legs, I don't want to just leave her off my ticket completely, even though I'm not keying on her. And then the 8 Embrace Me and the number 10 Maria's Revenge is the other backups that I mentioned. And that is a look at this Tampa Pick 5 sequence. I don't know if you'd agree with me that this is a tough ticket to put together, but I just hate legs like that middle maiden event where I don't have a strong opinion. I just feel like I'm, putting myself in a box, having to just sort through some horses that I just don't have high confidence in.
Yeah, I think we could probably spend a whole another hour and 20-minute podcast talking about ticket structure and pick fives. But I think sometimes what I do in those situations is I kind of create one ticket with like the horse that I think is the best value. And for me in that race, that's where I probably have a stronger opinion on Lucha Von Listelle than you did. So I would kind of make an opinion with all of my backups with him or with her, and then do a secondary ticket with smaller, less backups with the major horses. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's kind of
100%
sequences.
Well, Michael, I appreciate you making the time to come on this week. And I know I kept you a little bit longer than I promised. This one went a little long as I look at the clock on our recorder right now. But I really appreciate you doing this, and always enjoy getting your perspective on the show.
No, I love doing it, David. I respect the podcast so much. I respect the work you and Craig do. It's always a pleasure to be invited on. And I think we give people plenty to chew on, and I don't think it's a waste of their time either.
Well, hopefully we gave out some ideas that people can use playing the Tampa sequence this weekend. Everybody, thanks for tuning in. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Like I said, Craig will be back next Friday. I still have to see if I'm going to do a podcast, Pacecast next week in the early part of the week. I guess I'll see how the weekend racing comes up and if there's enough to talk about. But definitely we'll be back with a forecast with Craig at the end of next week. So look forward to that. Thanks for listening, everybody.